Good evening and welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Gujarat Institute of Civil Engineers and Architects, GICEA, who have partnered with us for this lecture today. GICEA is a premier institute of civil engineers and architects and professionals engaged with the building industry. Today's lecture is by Scot Wrighton on the role of private cities in India's urbanization, opportunities and challenges. Scot Wrighton is currently city manager of Streator, Illinois, USA. He has served as city manager of Lavasa, India, and Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois, USA. He has been faculty member at the University of Georgia's Vinson Institute of Government. He is also visiting faculty at CEPT University for a course on government ethics and a summer course that he's been teaching at Lavasa for the last 3 years. He has been a member of the International City Management Association, ICMA, for nearly 30 years. Scot holds a bachelor's degree in history and political science from Sterling College, a master's degree in history from University of Hawaii, and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Kansas. Please welcome Scot Wrighton.
Good evening and thank you for coming. Please sit up in the front so that I don't really have to be close to this microphone. Well, I think that everyone really knows the context for this discussion. It's been my pleasure to live in India for 5.5 years and to come to the CEPT University campus several times. But for those of you who somehow might have missed the context for all of this, it really is that India's urbanized population is now about... can you hear me in the back? If so, I don't need to... I am kidding, so I don't know So I think everybody understands the context. India's current urban population is a little over 30%, and according to the projections, the urbanized population in India sometime after the year 2030 will reach 55%. At about the same time, roughly, as India will become the largest country in the world, will pass China as the most populous country. And what those percentages mean is that over the next 15 or 20 years or so, more than 325 million Indians move from rural India to urban India. That's more than the population of my country, the United States, moving from rural India to urban India in a fairly short period of time, a migration that is unprecedented in its magnitude in human history. And we propose, I guess by implication, to move all those people. I don't know what's happening with the video up here. We propose to move all those 320 million people into the existing Mumbais and Delhis and Chennais and Calcuttas of the world. And what that really requires us to do, to sort of put it in a different context, is that during those next 15 years or so, no, it's fine now. Oh. Yeah. Is that over the next 15 years or so, when that 55% threshold is reached, is that every 3 months we need another city ready to go, populated the size of Ahmedabad. One more Ahmedabad every 3 months for the next 15 years. And it is that urgency around which this talk is really based. It's not so much about the pros and cons of privatization, so much as whether or not privatization of urban services can, in the urgency of this hour, be something that can reasonably be considered. Is it a viable strategy or not? So this talk is probably not exactly what you might have expected today. It's not so much about the inner workings of public-private partnerships as it is about governance. Because without governance reform and governance in general, no progress can be made. The next thing I want to say is that there is no, I'm absolutely convinced after being here in India for many years and having worked in an urban environment for my career, is that there is no single solution to the problem of urbanization in India. I think there's folks who write about it and they've got their single solution. There is no single solution. I think that there's a different strategy for the mega cities, you know, for the half a dozen cities in India that are 8 million, 9 million people. There's a different strategy for the ones that are not mega cities. There's also a different strategy for creating new greenfield cities. That's where Lavasa has its mark, is in that third area. Lavasa doesn't solve the problems by any means of all of urbanization in India. It simply has a strategy and a model for medium-sized greenfield cities. And equally important, I think, is a strategy for urban fringe townships. In India, the term township means a subdivision, a small homeowners association created by a developer whose interest in developing it ends when he sells the last lot, and then hands it over either to the homeowners association, the neighborhood association at the end of it, when that last lot is sold. And different states in India have got different approaches and different legislation governing townships. Most of them are haphazard, but if we're going to be serious about urban reform, then how we approach a township strategy has to be a key part of that. And fifth, I think that the answer to urbanization also is in whether or not that migration can be slowed a little bit, especially through more investment in transportation and telecommunications infrastructure, so that the jobs that people are seeking by moving from the villages to the cities might also be located in those villages, so as to make the appeal of cities a little bit less. So the point of this slide is just to say there is no single solution. I'm not advocating a single solution to the problem of rapid urbanization in India. It's much more complicated than that, and I think that it's along these lines. Now, the description of the session this evening is that was publicized and online, which I have up here. I'm not going to read it, but my point of reference for some of the comments that I'm going to make tonight certainly do come from my 5.5 years as the city manager in Lavasa, and I freely admit that saddles me with some degree of bias that's born of the frustrations we had in negotiating with the government of India and with the government of Maharashtra. While I found government officials and government bureaucrats generally willing to discuss PPPs and joint ventures, when it came to actually talking about the specifics of having the private sector directly involved in the ongoing management and operation of city services, they were aghast. And I would say that most, not all, viewed the idea of that as little short of a surrender of sovereignty. And some government officials actually use those words. You cannot ask us to surrender sovereignty. So I think that the notion of privatization of municipal services is still not widely understood at all. Now, the issue of whether or not there's a meaningful role for the private sector really depends on what your definition of meaningful is. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, because certainly the private sector and lots of consultants and contractors are already involved in discussing how urbanization can be influenced by the private sector. But I'll leave up to you at the end of this talk as to whether or not that's really meaningful. But the issue of reconciling India's brand of democracy with all of this is really not a difficult issue at all. And when you understand the way that privatization of cities work in those countries where it's practiced, which are functioning and in some cases mature democracies, it's a structure that requires that services be accountable to the government, and that the government gets the last say. I mean, the bottom line is the government gets the last say because they're the government. They get to set the scope and the parameters of service delivery based on predetermined metrics, and if the private sector somehow fails, then they get their contracts canceled. It's as simple as that. If people want to modify the scope of the services based on democratically determined changes in public policy. That's how the process works. And so it's not like that the control over government services is given over completely to the private sector. And in the final analysis, I ask folks, do you really care who owns the street lights or the water plant or the sewer plant and other assets of the city if you get good water and sewer and street light services? Do you really care who actually owns the assets? So here are the key points that I want to cover this evening, and I'll do so fairly quickly within the time frame I think that it's supposed to be, so that you're still awake and can contribute to our discussion with questions and answer. And I oftentimes think that's really where some of the fun part is in the questions and answer. What's not fun is that this thing keeps choking out on me. But it usually comes back, so it's okay. The first point that I want to make, and I mean no offense to anyone, is that local government by structure in India has trouble keeping their eyes on the ball. There's a lot of good people, and I've met many of them who are working in local government in India, but the system is dysfunctional structurally because the policymaking process and politics are not separated from the service delivery system, and the political process, and as a result, there's a lot of issues of stability. And while things are certainly getting better, in the 5.5 years that I was in India, I certainly saw a significant improvement in local government. Governance structure is still ill-suited to the demands that it faces, and you don't have to look any further than Gurgaon outside Delhi to see how that works. And you've got skyscrapers with no sewers underneath them, and more private security than public police officers. It's completely dysfunctional. So that's the first. So given that situation, there's certainly degrees we can be critical of it. It is what it is. Given that situation, does that create more of an argument for privatization or not? Second, the private sector can provide, I think, at least more consistency and execution over time if it's the right kind of contract. Now, PPPs, at least as they relate to government taking over services, have to look differently than they have in the past. Especially in India, I've learned. Local government officials have to come to grips with the fact that they'll have less control over day-to-day service delivery, but the private sector has to come to grips with something too, and that is that the amount of profit they get has to be transparently disclosed. I think one of the things that I've seen in the public debate here in India about public-private partnerships is an automatic suspicion that the private sector is going to reap huge rewards out of proportion to the services that they're providing. And I think that when we're talking about privatization of the full range of city services, the only way to reconcile that is to change the equation. Private business is entitled to make money, and we shouldn't be ashamed about that, but or in any way apologetic about it. But the amount of money should be disclosed, and it should be transparent. And as long as the company achieves certain benchmarks and certain outcomes, then they get this certain profit, no more, no less. And I don't think that that's been a part of the smaller experiments in public-private partnership, and it needs to be. But if there's a greater degree of privatization, what I've seen, what the Lavasa model tried to do, is that when it's done that way, there is much greater chance of FDI, there's a much greater chance of getting investment into the project from non-governmental revenue sources. Which goes to my third point, which is that the more that can be privatized, the more you can get outside governmental funding. What I'm going to say later on, well, I'll just go right to it. It's the part that's in bold. Right now, the private sector is involved as an advisor, as a trainer, as a consultant. There are all sorts of consultants running all over India with consulting contracts, and they're also willing to be an outsourced vendor to build the assets, to manage them on behalf of government. But these engagements by the private sector don't bring in new money. They don't bring in FDI. They don't result in large infusions of non-governmental revenue. What does do that is when the private sector can be the builder, owner, operator of service assets and then that contract is put together in such a way that he can be accountable for the outcome for indefinite periods, or at least until they want to be out, or they are not able to perform in accordance with the scope requirements of the contract. Now, this is a big leap, but when you can put them all together in one place, rather than just peeling off the pieces that have a good revenue stream, like the utilities, which is what's oftentimes been done, well, you can make money by having a toll bridge, or you can make money from the electric utility or the water sewer utility, but the whole of government services, including those that don't have reliable revenue streams, that's the harder part. And I think you can get that investment. This has been my experience and my observation in looking at other cities, not just in India, but other places in the world, when you bunch them all together. Some other parameters that I want to mention is that when you talk about, it's making it worse, the fundamental role of government, this is really where I find government officials, and maybe there's some government officials in the room this evening, and I don't mean to offend anyone, that government exists, ladies and gentlemen, to provide basic order and to perform those functions that inherently can't be legally delegated, and to have political rule that maintains, to the extent possible, the entity's public policy. Now, what inherently and legally can't be delegated is not always the same in different countries, even different states, but generally speaking, around the world, in democracies, what has to be done by government and nobody else are things like the military, other coercive powers where we make you do something whether you like it or not, making treaties, maintaining a common system for currency and land transference, and of course the administration of justice. Beyond that, theoretically, I think anything else can be delegated to the private sector, unless it's something that involves coercive services. So that's what I say about the fundamental roles of government. And we think about privatizing more aspects, more aggressively pursuing privatization, that's what I mean. Anything that is not part of that fundamentally non-delegable part of government. For government to work properly, whether it's done by privatization or it's done by the government the way it is now, requires high degree of transparency. Corruption happens, whether it's government or private, when there's a lack of transparency. And of course, the strict observance of the rule of law. I'm going to bring up a slide in a little bit that gives you some examples of some of the Indian cities that have been created new post-independence, and as well as talk about some other cities that are new cities in the world outside of India. I have intentionally left out capital cities because I believe that they are anomalies. Whether it's a national capital like Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, or the new capital of Myanmar that I can't even pronounce, or state capitals like Gandhinagar and Naya Raipur, and the new capital of Andhra Pradesh that's coming up, what is it? Amaravati, is that what it's called? These are governments around the world are generally willing to do whatever is necessary to make their seat of government successful. I mean, the primary business is one that you generally don't have to worry about losing. Government. And some of them, not so much in India, but elsewhere, become monuments to the people who are building them. So issues about viability and balancing revenues, making it pay for itself, all those things really don't matter as much when the government is building a capital city, a seat of government, whether it's for the state or the national government. So I have not included them, although there are certainly some very good best practices about how the city gets built, or some practices to avoid about a transit system or the utility system. That's why I haven't included them in some of the lists of cities that I'm going to show you. The other parameter for today's discussion, and hopefully our Q&A as well, that I have observed, and I don't really have a solution for it, is that there's very blurry lines in India between large townships and cities. On the north side of Mumbai is this very large township, although they like to call themselves a city, Palava. Eventually they hope that it's just to the east of Thane, and they hope to eventually be 4,000 acres. Today they're about 200 acres. But the difference between a township, whatever its size, and a city, I think has less to do with its physical footprint and more to do with what it's really about. A township is a township regardless of its size if what it's really about is just real estate, selling lots. And in the final analysis, that's what Lavasa is about. Even though it's nicely done in some respects, it's very large, and has enjoyed some degree of commercial success. When I asked them, so when the borders of Conde and Kayan, the other municipal corporation that's nearby, reach you, what are you going to do? Well, then they'll just incorporate us. So the notion of providing an entity that provides services is not really on their planning horizon at all. So that's a key indicator. Whether it's a township or whether it's a city. There are some wonderful examples of good townships and very well done townships in India. I think especially in Ahmedabad city in Pune, very good example. There are also some, as I'm sure that you're aware too, of some absolutely dreadful ones. Townships that have no water in them, even though they have people in them and have to rely on tanker trucks to come in. Townships that have only an ox cart trail to get to them because nobody bothered to get the easement for the access road acquired. And so, which sort of goes to the issue of why there needs to be a more concerted approach to developing good policy about townships. But fundamentally, good or bad, the difference between a city and a township is that a city sets out to be the provider of service to eventually grow into some kind of political organism that would have its own identity, rather than just be a development project primarily about real estate. Okay, let me pause for just a second to go back to a point that I made earlier about what is it, and I'm sure that I'm oversimplifying, but why is it that existing governmental structure at the local level makes it difficult to make major reforms and move quickly, even on things like the Smart Cities initiative that the Ministry of Urban Development is pursuing right now. And simply stated, local government works best when the governance, which is the shareholders, the citizens, can interface with the staff to provide good services. And I believe that generally speaking, there are exceptions of course, that what happens in India is that those get disconnected. They get disconnected because local government is largely an extension of the state government. The state government names the municipal commissioners. In most states, the Municipal Councils and Corporations Act, literally every other section says, subject to the approval by the district collector or the director of administration, the city can do fill in the blank, whatever it is. So the local government is constantly asking for permission to do something. And with that go all sorts of unrelated issues. So the state is preempting the local authority constantly. I lived in Pune for several years. They passed what I thought was a very broad-reaching and reform-oriented local ordinance about clearing the sidewalks of unauthorized encroachment. I mean, what's more local than that? Than being able to control encroachment on the sidewalks. It was never implemented because it wasn't approved by the state government, for reasons we all know. What? So there's this disconnect between the state, between the elected officials and the staff that produces the service delivery. On top of that is the problem that there's overlapping authorities, especially in the fringe areas outside of municipal corporation boundaries, with the Zilla Parishad, the panchayats, and all these that are listed, that have overlapping authority. This has been my experience. Is that one thing that the district collector says might not agree with what the forestry department says, which disagrees with what the Zilla Parishad says, and so these are problems that also make it difficult and extremely time-consuming to have new policy. So how does the private sector enter into that? And this is actually a slide that I sort of got from one of the consultants that is doing some work in this area. And so it's not mine, but basically what they're saying here is that the private sector is doing remember earlier in bold I said there's 3 ways that the private sector is involved in local government. As a trainer, consultant, advisor. Number 2, as a contract vendor, building things, or even on an outsourced contract basis, managing assets for a particular period of time for somebody else, but it's not an asset that they own. Okay, and that's what this is about. It's saying that those are the 2 things that they can do, and what the government has to do is create an environment for economic growth. Say that that's okay, in other words. Encourage PPPs. And this one, I like the terminology that viability gap funding where required. In other words, where whatever the initiative is, whatever the project is, or the public policy is, it doesn't have enough viability on its own merits, so the taxpayers have to subsidize it. Okay? So it's nice language for that. Okay? Investors won't support it because they don't think it's viable, so the taxpayers can. Okay? And if the only place where the private sector is entering is only as an advisor, teacher, and consultant, and only as someone who's basically saying, I'll manage whatever you want based on your scope of services, just pay me for it, then of course that kind of viability gap funding may have to always be a part of the equation. Maybe that's too harsh, but we can reserve that for Q&A. Let me take one quick tangent, perhaps the only major tangent of the evening for me, and that is to speak about the Smart Cities initiative that the Urban Development Department has been pursuing, and which I think some good things are going to come from. But I think that it's an example of this point that I'm trying to make, that the private sector really has only been invited into those first 2, to be an advisor and maybe to do some contract ops on outsourcing, and that's it. No one has been able to define for me what a smart city is. We're spending all these crores of revenue from the central government and proclaiming from one end of the country to the next the virtue of smart cities. What the heck is a smart city? Sorry, so I'm going to offer you mine. Now, there is no worldwide, much less Indian agreement on what constitutes a smart city. So this is Scott's idea. Now, this comes, I served for 5 years on the World Economic Forum's Urbanization Council. I've also served on a couple of committees of the international organization called the New Cities Foundation, which is based in France and is trying to develop some of these ideas too, without all of the baggage that the term smart city comes up with. I can't attribute this definition to them. Only say that some of my thoughts about it aren't just mine. A community where a strategic plan for leveraging innovation to achieve measurable, sustainable benefits is implemented. I'm probably being too harsh, but last June, when the Ministry of Urban Development came out with their program on smart cities, I was anxious to get a copy, and I got an advance copy. And I'm sorry, I was appalled. I mean, basically, the objectives were the same old things that the Ministry of Urban Development has been talking about for the last 10 years, including making sure that city employees are paid on time. This was right in there, okay? And what's different about smart cities is we're going to do it by adding a few gadgets. Same old thing, now we'll put some gadgets with it. And I believe, I know I'm being sarcastic, but I think that is basically how a smart city is defined in India. And I submit to you that that's putting the tools before the goal. The goal should be something different. The goal should be that our communities are sustainable, however we define that. And that's fundamentally different from one city to the next. Okay? But what I found in Lavasa is that sometimes a really low-tech solution is what we needed. And other times, a high-tech solution is what we needed. We thought about putting a GPS device on our buses so we could know where they're at all the time. It was a third the price with some older technology in RFID tags. So to heck with the most expensive, newest technology, what served our needs better and cheaper was to use RFID tags. When it came to processing solid waste, the older solutions worked best for us. When it came to surveillance technology, some of the latest technology is what we decided to deploy. how we decide between old technology or no technology and the latest technology by at least having some notion, certainly imperfect, but some notion about what our sustainability goals were first. Then we could decide what solution we could use, and in many cases it was a technology solution and not something else. So you've seen this little diagram about sustainability, that effective sustainability in local government is where you balance the social, economic, and environmental objectives. And in fact, elsewhere in the world, the smart city is used elsewhere in the world, but I would offer that sustainability is much more of a goal elsewhere than smart, in part because it's much easier to define and easier to quantify as well. And this was actually something I got from some Indian friends, that smart city is really about these things, working together, so that once you need leadership to say what it's about. That leadership can help you identify those standards, those performance outcomes that you want to achieve, and most of those are related to sustainability. Then you can fashion the kind of governance and regulation necessary to achieve those same things. Once you've gotten that far, then you know what can be privatized, what shouldn't be privatized, and then which local sources, which local systems are going to best fit it, because sustainability has a different solution and a different answer depending on the locality. And then with all of that, then you know how then you can provide meaningful feedback to your leaders about how they change the course of their strategic leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what a smart city is, in my opinion. But what has happened, I think, and here's some more details about how that works, that sort of go with each one of those. And so what the consultants should be doing is helping us through this very difficult labyrinth. And you can't read this because it's too small, but it doesn't matter. It's complicated to pull those 5 things together. And so, but what I have seen too many consultants do, not all of them, is just say, if this is what the government wants, that's what we'll do. If that's what the government wants, that's what we'll give them. And I think that can be illustrated to a certain extent in the governance issues created by some of the new cities that have come up in India since independence. Everybody likes, at least in the talks that I've given and interactions I've had, people like to start with Chandigarh. I love Chandigarh, but it is a project that everything is owned and managed and by the government. In fact, those of you who know the history of Chandigarh know that Nehru himself personally intervened on a regular basis with the architects so that it was exactly what he wanted. That's fine, but it was certainly not a privatized project. Sri City and Mahindra World down in the Chennai area, Gift City here, Hinjawadi, which is even more loose than Gift City. Cyber City, the Karnataka version, actually does have a governance attached to it. Cyber City, I think that term is used in several different places. I mean, there's really not a governance for what DLF calls Cyber City outside of Delhi, but at least in Karnataka, they've actually had a state assembly approved form of government that goes with it. It's an expanded form of the industrial township. And then there's the very unique example of Sidco in Navi Mumbai, where the government created a government company to develop the land and then turn it over to a new government company called the Municipal Corporation of Navi Mumbai. And more recently, we see some adaptations on that with Auric, which is the Aurangabad industrial city, and DMIC, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. And all of these are basically based on the same model, where the State Industrial Development Corporation or Commission is basically the developer, and then there's either an SPA or some other kind of SPV that is created to manage the company, but in both cases they are arms of the government. And using that model, they basically thought the same way about the Smart Cities Initiative. If you think about it, they use different terms, but the smart cities are supposed to have this separate SPV that is responsible for implementing some of the initiatives of the smart city, which really means they want to be isolated, rather insulated from the day-to-day apparatus of local government. but it's still just two arms of, it's an arm of the government working with another arm of the government. Okay? And then there's some unique forms like Nanded City in Maharashtra. And then there's Lavasa. And Lavasa is unique. Lavasa's mistake was that they started going down this road thinking that the government would eventually approve a different governance form, but they didn't. There's a famous quote from a North American named Wayne Gretzky. He's in ice hockey, and he's quoted as saying, he's one of the greats in ice hockey. He said, "I never skated where the puck is. The puck is this hard rubber thing that gets batted around the ice. And he says, I never skate to where the puck is. I skate to where I think the puck is going to be." And in Gretzky-esque ways, what Lavasa did is we thought we were going to skate to where the puck was going to be. We put together a system where the government didn't give us any land. We went out and bought it all ourselves. The government didn't give us any other concessions other than they gave us forgiveness on some land transfer fees, and they allowed us, through some changes in legislation, to acquire more real estate than a private corporation in India usually is allowed to acquire. And they made some changes to the Maharashtra rules with regard to Hill Station Act, and they allowed us to create a special planning authority, SPA, that was truly unique, that instead of it being managed by the government, because special planning authorities are sort of pretty governmental, they let the special planning authority actually be the private corporation. Fairly unique. So they didn't give us any land, they didn't give us any money. They said, okay, you can go do this truly in a privatized way. But the special planning authority although the special planning authority in Navi Mumbai still exists after more than 40 years, legislatively it's intended to be a temporary thing, something that exists for the purpose of government only until the city is developed, and then it can become a municipal council or a municipal corporation. So we started off with great optimism, thinking that the special planning authority would be sufficient and we would eventually have a different form of government, but that didn't come to pass. And the very idea that Lavasa could be this far from what the government's normal approach to governance is, which you can see more on the right side of the screen, I think goes to the difficulty that we had in Lavasa. All the publicity about environment and land claims by villagers is all rubbish and eyewash. This is what it was really about, is that Lavasa proposed to do something with governance and complete privatization of everything that could reasonably be delegated that had never been done before in India. We got ahead of ourselves, I think, to a great extent. And here's one of the reasons why this remains a legal issue that's a barrier. Those of you who know governance will recognize this as Section 243Q of the Indian Constitution, where it describes the 3.5 forms of local government you can have in India. 3.5 forms. Okay? You can have, once you're beyond panchayat, once you're beyond the gram panchayat of the local village, then there are 3.5 forms of local government that the Constitution prescribes. The Nagar Panchayat, and then once they're large enough, then they become a municipal council, and then they become a municipal corporation. Now, thankfully, the Indian Constitution does not define any of these terms. Well, that's a good thing, actually, because it allows each state to define it. So, I don't know what it is in the other 28 states, but in Maharashtra, for example, municipal councils are A, B, and C municipal councils based on their population. Under 25,000, under 50,000, under 100,000, I think is what it is. Okay? And then once you're over 100,000, you keep on growing until you reach the threshold ill-defined in statute to qualify eventually as a municipal corporation. And then there's this half one called an industrial township, which is not really a city at all. It just says that if you have an industrial township, whatever it is, because it's not defined, then the city council or the city corporation can't absorb it. So Lavasa is 50 kilometers away from Pune. But if Pune was right up against Lavasa, they could have absorbed us at any time by action of the state, okay? Because we are not one of those. And any form of reform that would provide, for example, I mean, if the Maharashtra government had said, okay, we're going to let Lavasa be a private city, and we're going to create a law called private cities, it would have been instantly challenged through PIL, probably, because it's not one of these. So any serious privatization of cities that requires, some kind of governance reform is going to hit this barrier. But the good news is the Constitution doesn't define these terms. So let me tell you, so basically what I'm going to say, sort of to jump to the spoiler alert part of this, is that what is the role for truly privatized cities, going beyond just providing consulting and advising and doing outsourcing? What is the future for truly privatized cities in India? None, unless there's governmental reform. Now, I'm optimistic that there could be. It happens on a state-by-state basis. This is not a federal subject. Each state can do this on their own. That's the Indian Constitution too. And so, I mean, as you know, some states have have given back authority under the 74th Amendment. Some haven't, because states have that power. And I believe that what is likely to happen is that some states will say, let's experiment with this, and others won't. And we'll see how it works. So, but without governmental reform that defines these terms differently, I don't think we have to change the Indian Constitution. I don't advocate that. I think that these kinds of governmental reforms can happen on a state-by-state basis. But without that, there is no future for privatization of cities. And if there's no future for full privatization of cities, then there is very little likelihood for large infusions of revenue from non-governmental sources and FDI. Let me tell you how we fought this in Lavasa, just as a way of giving some context to this. Lavasa is a designated area of 24,000 acres, nearly 100 square kilometers. It's a huge area. And we only did planning on about the western 60% of it or so, which is why the rest of it is white. Doesn't mean we didn't have that area, just we hadn't done any urban planning in that area because it was going to take 20 years just to develop the west side. Through the Special Planning Authority, we had adopted our development control regulations, which were approved by the State Planning Department, Maharashtra Town Planning Department. And what we then did is create a structure, and this goes to the investment and revenue part of it. Where does the money come from? The money comes from basically three different pots of money. First is we sold real estate too. Second was we operated the services of the city as revenue producers to try to cover costs. And then we created somewhere in excess of 50 special purpose vehicles for all the different operations of the city, including those that would be traditionally a private sector. And in many cases, the corporation, the Lavasa Corporation, was a majority shareholder. In some cases, they were a minority shareholder. In some cases, they owned 100%, but expected to divest themselves at some point when it was economically advantageous to do so. And these ones in red are SPVs that we created primarily around the city assets. Okay? Some of them were really easy and obvious, like the power utility or the water and sewer utility. But we also took all the bridges and all the roads and the dams and the parks and the promenades and put them into an SPV. Where's the revenue from that? You can't charge somebody to walk on a promenade. So the common area maintenance fees, to the extent that they reflected our investment, became that revenue source. And when we were managing it all together, that worked and was able to attract investors to it because it was all part of an aggregated system of running the city. So we had SPVs that were obvious moneymakers, some that weren't. I mean, maintaining the public realm area, it doesn't make money. But you got to have parks, you got to have streets, you have to have those public areas for a city to be a city. But if you amalgamate them with those that do make money, then you can get over that. But it requires that the government appreciate that as well and be able to give over more of the sort of to the private sector those services, except those that sort of by constitution have to be done because they're coercive services. Does that make sense? So here's something else that we did. We didn't have a local government yet at the time that I left Lavasa, but we tried to plan for it, and I ran an organization so it would look like one. And then with these SPVs, we would contract with them. This did a couple of things for us. First, it set up the city so that it operated like a city, even though it was a private corporation. The other thing that it did is it protected the assets. The Lavasa Corporation didn't own the roads and the promenades and the bridges, and they divested that infrastructure into these private corporations, which meant that they were charging for their services, for the use of their assets. It also meant that if the government decided to be capricious and seize the assets, it would be harder for them to do that because they'd have to go after each of these separately. So it was a bit of protection. So that was how we did it. So that in time, here's another way of illustrating it. We created a management company called Sahyadri City Management, named after that part of the Western Ghats there in Maharashtra, called the Sahyadris. And this management company had no assets. But they were strictly a management company and supervised these silent asset holding companies. Now, what would be better is a form of government, a special municipal council. But in the absence of that, and in the inability to get that approved by the state legislature, we created it ourselves because we thought that's where the puck would be. And we provided services that look a lot like a city would provide. And unlike Mumbai and many other big cities, it was all provided by one entity of government rather than multiple ones. Okay? So our idea was, anyway, that when it was all mature, that some kind of governmental form would exist to operate these services, and the Lavasa Corporation would operate its interest in the rest of these in the non-governmental side. And those two entities together would make a privatized city. I still think it's a great concept. It's not the only model. There's lots of different hybrids of that. But most of the solutions that we've had conversations about at the governmental level have been, can we have a more robust description legally about what constitutes an industrial township? For example, in Karnataka, they passed a law in 2003 that says that industrial townships can have the same authority as other municipal councils. We suggested that to Maharashtra. They said, no, that's not what industrial townships are for. Or can you create a municipal council and call it, we had A, B, and C in Maharashtra. What if you had a municipal council D, the next letter of the alphabet, and a D municipal council would be one that, I don't know, is for private city development, where the private corporation has acquired at least 10,000 acres, where they have invested a certain number of crores of rupees in infrastructure, where their master plan has been approved by the town planning department, or whatever. Some fairly high thresholds. And when you have that kind of threshold met, then the developer can provide these services for at least 20 years or so. And then at the end of that 20-year development period, then you discuss whether or not it becomes a more traditional municipal council by referendum or something like that. Because clearly during the development period, the developer has to be free to not necessarily have the local residents say, no, we want to have lesser fees, right away before the city is developed. So those are some, I think, reforms that are doable, that can be accomplished within the realm of political possibility, because it doesn't require changing the Constitution. It just requires some thinking outside the box at the state level. So far we haven't seen that, but I'm optimistic it may come. What we've seen is the model that the nodes of the DMIC and some of these other projects have taken. So what are some examples of fully privatized cities? In suburban Atlanta in the United States, there are at least half a dozen brand new cities that have been created since 2005. In fact, they are not new cities like Lavasa because they've been fully developed for years, but the state legislature wouldn't allow them to be created into a new city. So one of them, the largest one, Sandy Springs, when it came into existence on December 1st of 2005, was automatically the 7th largest city in that state. And everything is privatized. They have a total city employment of 6 people, because everything else is privatized, and including the assets for the most part. Now, they decided, because of the law in that state, that they couldn't completely delegate out law enforcement power. The ability to arrest you is something that shouldn't be given to a private company. So there are some exceptions to that. But the way it works is that the City Hall is in a rented office building, and the Public Works Department owns no rolling stock, no fleet, no asphalt machines, because they hire a private company to do that. And the private company may be in Sandy Springs today, and then they're in Johns Creek tomorrow, and then they're in Dunwoody the next day, and they put on a different shirt with a different city's name on it, and they put on a different magnetic decal on the truck with a different name on it, and achieve efficiencies that way because it's been fully privatized. Now, this is easier to do in new cities because you don't have an entrenched, institutional resistance that you would in any city. Even if you go and Google this about the privatization in existing larger cities, you're going to find these two mentioned frequently, London and Toronto, in part because there's a lot of opposition to some of the privatization that Mayor Boris Johnson is doing in London, and that the Toronto metropolitan area has tried. Pro or con, these cities have been at the forefront of trying to privatize. It is much harder to do in an existing historical city than it is in a brand new city, which is why the list is longer over there. In Nigeria, this Echo Atlantic City, which is just outside Lagos, it's still on planning boards, but it reflects the desperation of the Nigerian government. The corruption is so bad that the ability to have continuity of government is so bad that even at the planning stage, they're just willing to say, private entity, just take it. Just take it. That level of desperation does not exist in the United States or in India either. And perhaps it's more obvious that they need to do something that drastic in Nigeria. King Abdullah Economic City, I hesitate putting that one up there because Saudi Arabia is not a democracy in the first place. It's also a private city on the coast of the Red Sea, and it's actually managed by a Dubai-based company. Emaar Group is the primary investor in it. But it's also fully privatized, not dissimilar to Lavasa in the sense that the government said you can have this land, although it's just desert anyway, but you have to raise all the money for it. So the Indian preferred model so far is they're at least partially owned, if not fully owned, by the State Industrial Development Corporation, and then by an SPV or an SPA, Special Planning Authority, that have to work in tandem. Now, before I conclude, I want to mention that I want to draw attention to something I call the Songdo hybrid. Songdo is in South Korea. It's been trumpeted widely as a great example of a new city. It is not a city. It is a neighborhood of Incheon. Incheon is a huge city, nearly the size of Seoul, lying between Seoul and the west coast of Korea. And what the city of Incheon did is they said, we've got these reclaimed areas, and we're going to give Gale International, who's the developer, huge discretion to develop this. They periodically have to come back to us and get their master plan approved, but other than that, they can do it, and all we're going to do is provide the heavy infrastructure. We'll run the light rail to it from the rest of Incheon. We'll put in the bridges and the major connecting highways and the main trunk electrical lines and water lines. But after that, Gale International, you have to build the rest and recover that from your from the sale of your property and from the value added that you provide to the real estate, which you will get to keep, and you provide services within broad parameters that are set by the city of Incheon, because it's fully inside the boundaries of Incheon. So, is there a possibility that in India, private corporations can be involved directly in this level of privatization? No, not without government reform. But it doesn't have to be as drastic as what we tried in Lavasa. It could be something less drastic, like Songdo, where a city, maybe like Ahmedabad, says, okay, in this area that's developing, we'll let a private corporation, maybe an L&T or somebody big like that, who has the capacity to do that, do something like this. So there are hybrids, but even this hybrid would require some governmental changes. Even this would require some amendments to the state laws to have that kind of authority. So the number of cities in the world using high and advanced degrees of privatization to perform traditional government services is relatively small. I acknowledge that, I admit that. But if we're going to look seriously at this model, because we're not achieving one new Ahmedabad every 3 months. It's not, I mean, how are we doing on that? Not so good. So the critics of higher degrees of privatization say, well, Scott, it's not been used that extensively in the world. True enough. But does the urgency of this urbanization trend, this tsunami that's going on in India, warrant that some kind of Indian hybrid of this be tried as a way of accelerating this? Because using the existing model, and I'm not saying that the DMIC nodes aren't going to work. I'm not sure that they're really cities. They're really just industrial pockets, not cities the way I think of them. But can they be successful? I hope and pray that they will be. But they take a long time to develop. And they're starting with only 7, and that is a 15-year timeout, and they're actually and they're behind schedule anyway. So how do we make these new cities happen faster? So I don't have all the answers for all the details of what that contract would look like, but conceptually I wanted to introduce this to you today because I think that some Indian version of it is the need of the hour. Otherwise, it's not enough. And this is what bothers me about the Smart City Initiative. Some good things will come of it. I'm certain of that. But I think that the implication is that if we just have smart cities, that'll take care of the problem. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that it will. We haven't defined what smart city is anyway. And to think that smart cities alone is going to take care of this 325 million people moving to Indian cities by early 2030s doesn't seem to be practical to me. There need to be other strategies. And for what it's worth, I think this is one that should be considered by all of us. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Scott. Since I hold the mic, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first couple of questions. You talked about the 3 sources for revenue in Lavasa, and one of them was some form of taxation or service charges. That's my question, because if you're not a city, you can't charge tax. So how do you manage that?
You're absolutely right. If we're not one of those that are listed in the Indian Constitution, then we don't have the authority to levy tax. And so what we did, pretty creative really, as a workaround, and that is that nobody actually owns property except Lavasa. And so if you bought a flat or a villa or any other property for that matter, including commercial and industrial, in Lavasa, what you bought was a 999-year lease. Not 99, 999-year lease for 1 rupee a year. I don't care about the rupee. What I cared about is the fact that you had to sign a 35-page lease, and in that lease, you agreed to all sorts of terms and conditions, one of which was that you would pay our common area maintenance fees, as well as something we called city management services fees for the larger street maintenance and street light maintenance and things that the individual utilities wouldn't pay, things that taxes are supposed to pay in a city, but they aren't taxes. So we realized a lot of revenue from that. And I didn't expand a lot on those three sources of revenue. The other real, I think, innovative thing about those sources of revenue is that we got revenue from sale of property, of course, but the problem with that is that after a while that goes away when all the property is transferred. So how do we make sure that we have long-term financial sustainability? Two things. First is we make sure that those municipal revenue sources, fees for service, city management services fees, common area maintenance fees, special use fees, all those other things, can be as close to self-supporting as possible. And then all those 50, 60 some SPVs, the Lavasa Corporation was a shareholder in them. So as those businesses would mature, we would gain revenue from them. For example, we convinced all of the hotels to not have a laundry, but instead we would have one centralized laundry facility. And we found this guy in Pune who had something, I don't know anything about laundries, something called a tunnel laundry that would handle this on a large industrial basis. We said, we'd like you to bring this to Lavasa. And he said, too far away, too big a risk. Okay. We'll pay 80% of the capital, you pay 20% of the capital, and then we'll pay you a management fee to run it because we don't know how to run it. He says, okay, I'll do that. So we own 80% of the laundry. He owns 20% of the laundry. So he gets 20% of the profits plus his management fee. And I don't know, 5 or 10 years from now, if it really expands well, then he could buy more of it back from us at whatever the then market value share is. Or not. If he doesn't, then we continue to make 80% of the profits. So, so there's a mechanism in place that as the city grows and economic activity expands, then there's revenues to replace, but will obviously be a naturally declining real estate revenue.
Thank you. My second question was about, you said you're not very eager to have sort of government reform before we get to this point, because that's obviously more difficult than to try and get the private cities in place. But my question was about how does all the examples you mentioned in Georgia or in United States, what's the language in the state law that allows people or groups of people to come together and incorporate as a city? What's the mechanism between that and the state decision making that allows us?
In the United States, as in India, there's a great deal of discretion and autonomy given to states. And how a city is chartered and created and established is different from one state to the next. In some states, for example, a local group of citizens can have a referendum and just do it. In other states, it requires action by the state legislature. So there's a difference from state to state. But what I can say about at least 49 states, there was one that's kind of an anomaly, is that the system for creating new cities is pretty mature, and it allows a fairly broad discretion on the part of local governments to decide what they want to delegate to a private provider. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, though. And the other thing I want to say is that I think you misunderstood me. I am anxious, not reluctant, anxious to have governmental reform here in India, because I think that if there's just a few states, I don't know which ones, but if there's a few states that would start and say, okay, we'll try this, then I think that if a couple of good demonstration projects would start things rolling, and people would realize, okay, if this state can do it, then it can be done somewhere else. I mean, in Lavasa, we weren't trying to say to the Maharashtra government, change all of municipal government. Goodness sakes, no. What we were saying is, experiment with us. Have some special enabling legislation that just relates to us, and then if it works, great, then you can replicate it or scale it up. If it doesn't work and it fails, that's our money that went down the toilet.
Thanks.
You saying that
I think this is only the question, and then he'll come back to you. Sorry. Go ahead.
So my question is related to the urbanization, as well as we see the class one type of class cities. How it would be taking care of these inequalities, basically how the bigger cities are growing more and more, and to to just go for the decentralized or the concentration, higher concentration or deconcentration towards which the private cities would be go in that manner where there are concentration of high urbanization or deconcentration?
If I understand your question, I think the answer is one size does not fit all. In some local governments, based on the types of service they have or where they're at or how big they are, the privatization might have to look one way. In a different city with a different mix, then it might look differently. And I think that's something for local leaders and local decision makers to decide. To have one model that everybody uses will not work. There's so much diversity in Indian cities that, and it's another reason why I believe strongly that there needs to be more autonomy and the state sort of taken out, and basically the 74th Amendment implemented properly, so that there's more decision making at the local level, because you're absolutely right. You can't generalize about this. It has to be sort of custom made for each city. But before you can do that, you have to have enabling legislation to do it. Did I answer your question?
You analyze that there were 5 private cities in Georgia. So in a single state, why it is so? Have you analyzed or can you highlight on that something? Is there any common boosting thing?
Well, it really relates to some local politics that aren't relevant to the creation of new cities. That they're all in the suburbs of Atlanta, which is the largest city in Georgia. And what happened was that over nearly a generation, the legislature was controlled by a political party that didn't believe in creating new cities. And then the legislature changed and was controlled by a different political party that for the first time in 100 years was in control of the state and believed in creating new cities. So it was like opening the floodgates that had been kept artificially closed for such a long time. So what these cities found out is that by going together, I mean, they each were a separate political entity, but they found that they could save millions and millions of dollars by working with each other to hire many of the same companies. In fact, the company that they hired, most of them hired initially to do to privatize, was a company that's very active here in India, CH2M Hill. Does a lot of this kind of work. They eventually priced themselves out of the market, and so they don't control most of those cities today, but the other companies have come up in their place. So it happened because of that political history, not because of anything about new cities itself.
It's okay, but how do you analyze their success of the 5 cities and how it was successful, these 5 cities? Result of it?
Well, I measure success by whether or not, A, they're efficient and the price of government per capita or per unit is less than it is provided by other services, and are they able to do that and still maintain and still achieve their performance outcomes. If people are getting good water, good police service, rapid fire protection, whatever the measurable outcomes are, and they're getting it for less money, that's success to me.
The other thing, like you told that there is no common definition of that, what is being smart in India, and there is some gadget or like that. But the 5 parameters or whatever you analyze that, they should have some global standards and efficiencies. Yeah, no,
I know which one you were talking about. I'm just going to get to it. This one. Oops. This one.
Yeah.
This one, right? Yeah.
These global standards for efficiency and sustainability, and these local enable and resource limiter. So how will you balance that? And how do you analyze these global standards of efficiency and sustainability?
Did everybody hear his question? He's saying, how do you evaluate, and although you didn't say it, how do you Indianize some of these standards? It's a very hard thing because the situation is different in different countries. The University of Toronto is sort of, I think, at the forefront of collecting local government, municipal performance data from all over the world, and making that available to cities.
The ISO 37120.
And that's another source, right? This new ISO standard. So, but I would say that even though we have the standard in the ISO and we have a tremendous volume of data in the work that the University of Toronto is doing, we still don't have a worldwide standard for what a sustainable city is, much less a smart city. But I think that we're getting there slowly.
No, ISO is only city parameters.
Right.
100 parameters.
But when we analyze these standards for efficiency, then it may vary from many parameters, just like waste disposal or water supply or even electronically or whatever it may for various parameters.
Well, and this is the problem of not only performance measurement but smart cities too, and it's why I argue that in the final analysis, a smart city isn't one that necessarily conforms to 10 certain selected parameters, because there's so much difference from city to city and certainly from country to country and state to state. So if a community has decided on its own that these are our objectives, here's what we want to achieve, and they know how to measure that, and then they can apply certain technologies or innovations to it, then ultimately that's what a smart city is.
There should be some reasonable general idea.
But I do think that even though I'm giving you a squishy answer, and I'm not willing to sign on to 10 or 20 or 50 parameters for what a smart or sustainable city is, I do think that there's much more progress to be made in at least getting closer to common benchmarks than we have now. But I think we are making progress internationally, not so much in India, but I think internationally we are. And I think that the Ministry of Urban Development is more and more reaching out for some of those standards too.
Combining these local sources and local resources in utilization.
Yes, sir.
I have appreciation for the questions for extending the wisdom to your model of a hybrid city. That's the model, is the site and services model conceived for providing housing to underprivileged. And that is extended to a hybrid city. And that's appreciated. The small scale project to large scale.
My name is Urban, architect and urban designer. I've worked on actually Mugaon very eventually.
Mugaon is a part of Lavasa.
So, after last year was almost 75% built and Mugaon was in phase of on the design board and in phase of moving forward in construction. There were a lot of issues where we learned from last year and we applied in Mugaon in terms of environmental sustainability. I think so that was at that point of time, Ministry of Environment, Ministry, and judicial authorities were pounding on Lavasa and the group, and there were major challenges. So my question is related with what are the lessons from the implementation point of view, from the management point of view, from running the city point of view that you want to share, and maybe in the next values that or maybe in the other kind of developments of similar nature that we can incorporate while we are there on the design board itself.
Well, thank you for the question. To discuss all of the things that we learned, sometimes learned the hard way, in Lavasa would exhaust all the time we have and several nights more. The key learning that I tried to transmit here is that, listen, in my opinion, the Lavasa project is amazingly well planned. Its scheme is laid out very, very well. From a governance standpoint, we got it wrong. We thought that by putting a project together of this size and scope and impact, that the government would say, well, then obviously we have to give you an innovative government form. That was naive on our part. And the learning is, what we should have done is make sure that we had a governance charter and certain amendments to the state enabling legislation in Maharashtra that I've referred to several times. That's the governmental learning. From a design standpoint, which is more your focus, from an environmental standpoint, from a public facilities and infrastructure standpoint, we entered the project realizing that DASVE, which is the name of the first phase, would help us figure out what to do differently. I mean, we learned things about how to do sewers differently, to how to design the windows differently, especially in a monsoonal location that gets 5,500 mm of rain in 4 months. that had to be, figured into the design. And we were open to that, and we made those changes as we went along. It was very much a learning process. But let me emphasize that the environmental issues raised by the MOEF were manufactured nonsense. I mean, after 77 approvals from the state government and 6 from the federal government, J.M. Ramesh woke up one day and said, "Oh, you guys should have talked to the federal government about this first," and used that as an excuse to shut us down. It had everything to do with their opposition to the form and frankly, everything to do with Congress's opposition to NCP in Maharashtra. It had absolutely nothing to do with the merits of the project. But this is how things happen. And if you don't have your enabling legislation in place, then you're vulnerable to that. And that was the most important learning, even beyond the design issues that are perhaps more of interest to you.
I have a comment and a question, and the two are related, I think. So in your opening remarks, you talked about urbanization and the kind of growth of population in urban centers that we're going to see over the next 20 or 30 years. And you seemed to emphasize rural-urban migration as the main cause of that. I think recent statistics over the last 20 years, perhaps more than people here would be able to correct me, seem to show that by now, more than rural-urban migration, it has naturally increased within the existing urban populations. And the recategorization of different kinds of urban centers that is contributing to urban growth and urbanization. Now, related to this comment is my question that in everything that you presented, I did not see anything that suggested recognition of the unorganized or the informal sector of the economy, which is something we just cannot ignore in India. So where does that fit into your scheme of governance that we talked about? You spoke at great length about Lavasa, but implicitly I felt that even the other things that you talked about with the private sector management, it seemed to have the same kind of model in mind. So where does the unorganized or the informal sector of the economy fit into these smart cities or whatever you would like to call them?
Okay, you've asked several questions there. Let me see if I can cover them all.
Basically just one.
Yeah, and I'll get to the informal sector because I think that's the core of your question. The point you make about what is the real source of urbanized pressure coming from multiple sources, not just migration, is a point well taken. I draw primarily from the April 2010 report, the McKinsey Global Report on Indian cities, where much of this information comes from. But I would certainly acknowledge at least the partial validity of what you say is that it may also come from natural growth within the city, although generally urban populations tend to have smaller families than rural ones, and the fact that just the way that urban areas and municipal entities are designated may also skew the statistics. All of that may be true to some degree, but I don't think it changes the essential argument, which is that the existing urban centers are busting at the seams and don't have a way of dealing with it, and simply creating a few of these nodes along the DMIC corridor is too little too late. So more to the point of your question, which is these informal parts of the city. And by informal, I think that term, unlike smart city, is more widely understood and defined as the underprivileged, both the residential as well as the commercial areas of the city that just happen up on their own, whether or not they're actually permitted or zoned for in some way. I've actually written on this for the MIT Sensible Cities Lab about how to incorporate some of that in city planning. And I think that one of the mistakes that especially places in Malaysia and Indonesia have done with some of the new cities that they've created there is they simply didn't plan for it. They sort of, like you said, we all know that it exists in Asian cities, but so why isn't it reflected in the plan? I think that if you plan for it, In Lavasa, for example, and we didn't do it right, we made plenty of mistakes, which I freely acknowledge, but we allocated 25% of the housing, of the square footage for residential areas, to low-income rental properties that would be rented for 2,500 rupees a month. And we provided spaces. We had to guess a little bit about how much space it would need for market areas for those as well. So, because if you don't do that, then they'll happen up along the roadside whether you like it or not. And you'll have encroachment problems. And so you can't keep them from happening unless you provide for them. I don't really think, and I think that the issue of privatization is agnostic about that. I think it needs to be in the plan. So if the services are privatized, but the scope of the contracted services provides for that, then contract's a contract, I think, is the answer to the question. It's not, so what I'm saying is the answer to your question doesn't bear on privatization, it bears on the initial city plan and making sure that it's incorporated in the operations and management scope.
Can I ask a couple of questions? So my question is that, as you rightly mentioned in the starting, that Streator is a neighborhood and not a city. So why not something like that be actually implemented, like having private neighborhoods? Because we already have a lot of private colonies and those kinds of things. And then municipal corporation actually run the other services. So, and why have private cities and not those kind of smaller neighborhoods?
Well, I think the short answer to your question is it can. And that's why I introduced the Songdo hybrid, because I think that the Songdo hybrid is a less aggressive, less radical approach to changing governance. And my guess is that many state assemblies in India might be willing to try that experiment before they'd be willing to try a fully privatized experiment. But the other part of the answer to the question is that, in my opinion, it's only my opinion, townships, in India, these townships come up without regard to whether or not there's sufficient capacity in the water line or the power lines or the road network to support them. And there needs to be better legislation that provides for regional administration of that. And whether that's done by zoning or by impact fees or whatever, but I mean, there's just this mishmash of townships. At least in Incheon, the Korean government, who by the way is committed to doing privatized cities. I mean, they have two major corporations, one public, one private, whose business it is to build new cities that are privatized. So the mindset in Korea is completely different in the first place, okay? So, and so they're supportive of that, and so the local governmental culture supports it. But apart from that, Incheon looked at Gale International's plans and said, okay, here's how we'll fit into the rest of Incheon, and they were exercising that kind of regional look to say, no, modify it this way, we're gonna bring the light rail in over here, so change this node, rather than just having all these disconnected pockets. And so that's the other piece that has to happen. But can it happen in India? Yes, it just has to have some of those other refinements.
Yeah, I found this your solution to the Indian urbanization through this private city initiative somewhere mismatching, as my previous speaker said, that the context is very changed. You know, the way we are urbanizing is not the way the Western cities have been urbanized. We are urbanizing without industrialization. We are urbanizing in the poverty-driven area. We are urbanizing in the hinterland, which is not necessary. And that's the census town cities are concerned. And then in order to facilitate the other centers for urbanization, and from 31 to 50% of rate of urbanization, the migration need to be encouraged. And therefore, the migration is slowing down. Therefore, within the enclave, if you are looking at the private solutions to these kinds, I think it's going to be exclusionary. I may sound pessimistic about it, but it is exclusionary. Exclusionary in the sense that you will be restricting the wholesale migration, because the informalities are not going to be considered in the private city. Your governance system is also exclusionary, because you need to give permit to the people who will serve your cities. Lavasa is a classic example where shopkeepers, paper vendors, milk vendors are allowed to get entry after the permission is given by the private sector. This is undemocratic, number one. Number two, that if you are restricting this kind of migration, free flow of the people, you will be selecting the skilled one. We have large hinterlands in the rural area which are unskilled. If they are not allowed to come, how are you going to transform the society? which is largely rural, 31% only, 61%. It needs to increase, and therefore this kind of private initiative, to my mind, is going to slow down the pace of urbanization in the long run rather than in the short run. And this we have lessons to learn from the Gurgaon. Its growth rate is declining despite all those investments. What about Lavasa? The government is asking you back the land from your acquired land. 191 acres of land is now being asked back. So if that is the performance indicators, then I'm afraid that this kind of initiative is, rather than increasing the rate of urbanization or facilitating urbanization in India, rather than it's going to be slowed down. That's my opinion. I may be sounding very pessimistic, but this is how I understood the process of urbanization. Thank you.
If I have failed to make good connections in some of my points, then I plead guilty to that. I think the point I want to make, though, is that some privatizations have been in affluent communities. That is true. But that does not mean that they only work in those places. I think that they've been done there because the ability to make them financially viable is more clearly evident to investors on some of these initial projects. But the basic premise of privatization, if it's done right and it's done transparently, and many of these have not been done transparently, it's not so much a matter of denying rights to somebody. You can put whatever scope and whatever services, including democratization, into the contract if you want to. There have been failed and imperfect privatizations. There have been far more public failures of service delivery than that. I raise this, I think, as a possibility for accelerating the urban development, because if a certain number of services are put in a basket together, that can attract revenue that currently isn't being attracted. Now, the last thing that I'll say in response to what you'd said is that the issuance of permits, because of its implicitly coercive nature, is rightly a governmental function. Okay? And I think that in the same way that administering justice is in arresting you or incarcerating, I mean, those are things that only the government should be able to do because they involve saying that it's an involuntary action. Okay? So government should do those things, but apart from those things, then providing other sorts of services, I think, can be much more widely privatized, and that can be done more rapidly. So I don't think that I disagree with you as much as you think, actually. So thank you all very much. I'll stick around if there's some other questions, but thank you for your very kind questions and your kind attendance this evening.
Thank you, Scott. May I request Sri Vijay Patel, Vice Chairman of Mr. Kamlesh Modi, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation, sir.
My pleasure.
Good evening. I am thankful to today's speaker, Mr. Scott, respected chef, faculty members, members of GIC, students, dignitaries. I would like to share some information on GIC. The Gujarat Institute of Civil Engineers and Architects is a unique professional organization having more than 4,000 members. We are working architects and civil engineers both together as a non-government organization. The institute is closely associated with the construction industry. It always works for development and upgradation of the construction industry by various means, such as organizing seminars, technical lectures, workshops, exhibitions. The basic aim is to provide and create awareness about the latest technological development around the world to the members and technocrats. I am thankful once again for enduring joint program CEPT and GIC. Thank you all once again on behalf of CEPT University and GIC. Thank you very much.